2 standard galactic weeks after the decree, a Draven enforcement flotilla of 40 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system. The ships were enormous, each one shaped like a bladed fist, covered in thick armor plating that had been tested against every known weapon in the galaxy. They moved in perfect formation, their engines glowing a dull red against the black of space. Fleet Commander Gorath stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the distant yellow dot of Earth's sun grow slowly brighter. He was a veteran of 11 pacification campaigns. He had brought entire species to their knees. He had never lost a battle, and he did not expect to lose this one. His intelligence briefing told him that humanity had roughly 60 warships in total, most of them small, lightly armed frigates designed for patrol duty rather than real combat. Gorath opened a system-wide communication channel. His voice, deep and rough like stones grinding together, echoed across every frequency in the solar system. This is Fleet Commander Gorath of the Draven Hegemony, acting under the authority of the Galactic Council. All human military vessels will power down their weapons and hold position. All planetary governments will prepare to receive integration teams. Resistance will be met with force. You have 6 standard hours to comply. He closed the channel and settled back into his command chair. He expected to be done by dinner. Aboard the carrier vessel Resolute Horizon, which was holding position behind the dark side of Earth's moon, Admiral Vicky Dawson listened to the broadcast with her arms folded across her chest. She was 51 years old, compact and muscular, with iron-gray hair cut short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood. She had served in the Navy for 30 years, and she had a reputation for 2 things. She never raised her voice, and she never lost. Her senior staff stood around the tactical display. Lieutenant Kevin Price, her tactical officer, was a lean man with sharp features and quick hands who could read a battlefield the way some people read music. Ensign Molly Grant, her communications chief, was barely 25, with red hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a talent for making complicated systems do exactly what she wanted. 40 ships, Kevin said, studying the display. Standard Draven formation. Heavy armor. Slow turning speed. They'll come straight at us. They always do, Vicky replied. She looked at the display for a long moment, then turned to her crew. Signal the fleet. Deploy the net. Over the past 2 weeks, while Lena Morgan had been sending polite diplomatic messages, and President Calloway had been making calm public statements about seeking peaceful resolution, the human fleet had been very busy. Dozens of small, fast ships had been moving quietly through the outer solar system, seeding the space around Saturn's rings and Jupiter's moons with hundreds of thousands of autonomous mines. Each mine was small, barely the size of a washing machine, but each one carried enough explosive force to punch through standard hull plating. They were nearly invisible to long-range sensors, hidden among the rocks and ice and dust that filled the outer system. Gorath's flotilla moved inward at standard patrol speed, following the most direct route toward Earth. They passed the orbit of Neptune without incident. When they reached the outer edge of Saturn's rings, Gorath was reviewing crew rotation schedules and thinking about what he would eat when the mission was over. The first mine detonated against the hull of a Draven cruiser on the flotilla's left flank. The explosion tore through the ship's lower decks and sent it spinning sideways into its neighbor. Before Gorath could even stand up from his chair, 40 more mines found their targets, then 100, then 1,000. The space around the flotilla turned white with explosions. 9 Draven warships lost power in the first 90 seconds. 3 more collided with each other as they tried to change course. Gorath roared orders, demanding full shields and evasive maneuvers, but the mines were everywhere, rising out of the rings like a swarm of insects. each one locking onto the nearest heat signature and accelerating. It took Gorath's fleet 7 minutes to push through the minefield. By the time they emerged, trailing debris and fire, their formation was broken, and their shields were running at half power. Then the second phase began. 30 human frigates appeared from behind Jupiter's moons. They had been running with their engines cold, and their power signatures reduced to almost nothing, drifting in the shadows like sleeping wolves. Now they woke up all at once. Their engines blazed to life, and they came screaming across the gap between Jupiter and Saturn, at speeds that made Gorath's sensor officers shout in alarm. The frigates did not attack head-on. Human naval doctrine, developed over centuries of ocean warfare and adapted for space, was built on speed, surprise, and hitting the enemy where they were weakest. The frigates split into 6 groups of 5 and struck the Draven flanks from multiple angles, firing concentrated torpedo salvos at the damaged ships, before rolling away and coming around for another pass. Kevin Price sat in his tactical station aboard the Resolute Horizon and worked with calm, focused speed. His fingers moved across his controls like a pianist playing a difficult piece. He had spent the past 2 weeks studying every piece of intelligence they had on Draven warship systems, and he had found something interesting. The Draven used a centralized navigation network that allowed their fleet to coordinate movements through a single command system. It was efficient. It was also a vulnerability. Kevin launched a cyber intrusion package, a bundle of code designed by the best programmers on Earth, disguised as routine sensor noise. The package slipped through the Draven communication network and nested inside their navigation array. Then it activated. 12 Draven warships suddenly lost the ability to steer. Their engines fired at random, their navigation systems feeding them false data. 2 ships turned directly into each other and collided at full speed. 3 more drifted out of formation, their crews fighting helplessly with controls that no longer responded. Gorath watched his tactical display with growing disbelief. His ships were dying around him. The human frigates were too fast and too small for his heavy weapons to track. The mines were still detonating, and now his own ships were turning against each other. He ordered his fleet into a defensive sphere, pulling his remaining ships into a tight formation with overlapping shield coverage. It was a sound tactical decision, and it might have worked against a conventional enemy. But Vicky Dawson was not conventional. She brought the Resolute Horizon out from behind the moon, flanked by the remaining human capital ships, and drove straight at the center of the Draven sphere. It was a move that no tactical textbook in the galaxy would have recommended, because it meant flying directly into the concentrated firepower of 24 warships. But Vicky had noticed something that Gorath had not. When the Draven pulled into their sphere, they had positioned their damaged ships on the interior, protecting them with healthier vessels. This meant the outer shell of the sphere was made up of ships that were already stressed, their crews exhausted, their shields fluctuating. She did not need to break through the sphere. She just needed to crack it. The Resolute Horizon absorbed 3 direct hits on its forward shields as it closed the distance. The bridge shook. Lights flickered. Molly Grant grabbed her console and held on. Vicky did not move from her chair. "All ships, fire at will," she said. The human fleet poured everything they had into one section of the Draven sphere. Torpedoes, railgun rounds, and energy beams hit the same cluster of ships in a single overwhelming wave. The shields on 4 Draven vessels collapsed at once, and the explosions that followed ripped a hole in the formation. The human frigates poured through the gap and began hitting the damaged ships inside. It was over in less than an hour after that. Gorath stared at his tactical display, which now showed 26 of his 40 ships as red icons, meaning destroyed or disabled. His jaw tightened. His claws scraped deep grooves into the arms of his chair. He had never retreated before. He had never even considered it. He gave the order to withdraw. The surviving Draven ships limped toward the nearest relay gate, trailing smoke and sparks. As they went, Molly Grant opened a broadcast on all council frequencies. Her voice was young and clear, and carried no anger, no triumph, and no fear. "This is Ensign Molly Grant of the human carrier Resolute Horizon, broadcasting on behalf of the people of Earth. We have received the Galactic Council's decree regarding our classification as a subservient species. After careful consideration, Earth respectfully declines." She closed the channel and looked at Vicky. The Admiral's face had not changed expression throughout the entire battle. But now, just for a moment, the corner of her mouth moved upward by a fraction of an inch. On the silvered ring, High Speaker Zael received the battle report. He read it once, then read it again. The light inside his crystalline body flickered in a way his attendants had never seen before. Tirak stood in the corner of the room, waiting. He had finally gotten his memo through, and Zael had finally read the human archive. The High Speaker turned his great head and looked at the young analyst. "You tried to warn us," Zael said. "Yes, High Speaker." Zael was quiet for a long time. The light inside him pulsed slowly, shifting between colors that had no names in any human language. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "What have we done?" No one answered him. Outside the station windows, the stars burned on, silent and uncaring, as they always had. The Galactic Council did not send another fleet. The defeat at Saturn had embarrassed them. An embarrassment, among the elder species, was a wound far deeper than any military loss. Instead, they turned to the kind of war that left no wreckage floating in space, the kind that was fought with whispers and closed doors and slow, quiet strangulation. The Valori Intelligence Network was called the Unseen Thread. It had been operating for over 1,000 years, and its agents were embedded in every major civilization in the galaxy. Within days of the battle, the thread began pulling strings. Trade routes that had connected human allied systems to the broader galactic economy were quietly rerouted. Merchant vessels that regularly carried goods to and from Earth's colonies found that their docking permits had been revoked, their insurance policies canceled, their fuel contracts terminated. No one gave a reason. No one needed to. The Fenari, a species of small, clever traders who had been among humanity's friendliest contacts, received a visit from a Valori diplomat who made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that continued association with humans would make life very difficult for Fenari merchants across the galaxy. The Fenari Trade Council voted to suspend all human contracts the following day. The Telusians, a species of scholars and scientists who had exchanged research data with Earth's universities, were told that their access to the Council's shared knowledge archives would be restricted if they maintained contact with a subservient species. The Telusian government quietly stopped answering Earth's communications. On Earth, the effects arrived slowly and then all at once. The price of helium-3, a fuel component imported from Fenari mining operations, tripled in a single week. 2 human colony worlds reported shortages of medical supplies that had previously been sourced from Telusian labs. Rare minerals, essential to maintaining faster-than-light drives, became almost impossible to find on the open market. Lena Morgan felt the weight of it all settling onto her shoulders like a heavy coat. She had been promoted to Director of Galactic Affairs after the battle, a title that sounded impressive, but mostly meant she was the person who had to figure out how to keep humanity alive while the rest of the galaxy tried to choke it to death. She worked from a small office in Geneva, surrounded by screens showing supply chain data and diplomatic cables. And she slept on a cot in the corner because going home felt like wasting time. Danny Holt had been reassigned. Officially, he was on extended leave from the Navy. Unofficially, he was traveling through the galaxy under false credentials, moving from station to station and system to system. keeping alive the fragile web of relationships that the Council was trying to destroy. He traveled light, one bag, one sidearm, one set of forged identification papers that identified him as a freelance cargo inspector from a minor human colony. He grew a beard and let his hair get longer, and learned to walk with the slightly hunched posture of a man who spent too much time in low-gravity freighters. His most important contact was a Fenari trader named Resic. The Fenari were small, about 4 feet tall, with smooth brown skin and large dark eyes, and hands that had 6 fingers each. Resic was older than most of his kind, with patches of gray on his neck, and a way of tilting his head when he was thinking that reminded Danny of his grandfather. Resic had voted against suspending human contracts. He had lost the vote, but he had not changed his mind. They met on a neutral station called Waypoint 7, a grimy trading hub in an unclaimed system where nobody asked questions. Resic brought Danny to a small room behind a noodle shop and poured them both cups of something warm and sweet that the Fenari drank instead of coffee. "The thread knows you are here," Resic said. "They know about all of your back channels. They are very patient, Danny. They will close every door you try to open." "Then we open doors they don't know about," Danny replied. Resic tilted his head. "There are younger species," he said carefully. "Species that have been under the Council's heel for a long time. The Kalhari, the Dusani, the Volpeth. They are watching what your people did at Saturn. They are very interested. Interested enough to help? Interested enough to listen." Danny began reaching out, carefully and slowly, to representatives of species that the Council had long treated as minor players. He used Resic's trading network to pass messages, and he met contacts in places that had no names, on the dark sides of moons, and in the cargo holds of freighters, and in the back rooms of stations that smelled like engine grease and alien spices. What he found surprised him. The resentment against the Council was not new. It was very, very old. Species that had been classified as lesser, or junior, or provisional for centuries had been quietly angry for just as long. They had simply never believed that anything could change. The sight of 40 Draven warships retreating from a species with 60 ships had cracked something open in the galaxy, a tiny fracture in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. Meanwhile, on Earth, President Calloway's had authorized a program that only 12 people in the world knew about. It was called Long Stride, and it was run by a civilian engineer named Patty Nguyen. Patty was 43 years old, small and wiry, with black hair that she kept in a messy ponytail, and reading glasses that were always slightly crooked on her nose. She'd had 2 doctoral degrees, one in quantum physics and one in propulsion engineering, and she had a habit of talking to her equipment as if it could hear her. She worked from a research facility buried deep beneath the Nevada desert, in a complex that did not appear on any map. Her mission was simple to describe and nearly impossible to achieve. Humanity's current FTL drives depended on a mineral called varium, which was found naturally on only a handful of worlds, almost all of them controlled by Council-aligned species. As long as humans needed varium, the Council could control how far and how fast humanity could travel. Patty's job was to build a drive that did not need varium at all. She had a team of 30 engineers and physicists, a budget that was technically unlimited, and a deadline that was technically yesterday. She drove them hard, but never cruelly. When they worked late, which was almost every night, she cooked meals in the facility's small kitchen and carried plates to their workstations. When someone solved a difficult problem, she celebrated with them. When someone hit a wall, she sat beside them and worked through it together. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. A young engineer named Chris Layton, who had been running simulations for 16 hours straight, called Patty over to his screen with a shaking voice. He had found a way to generate the same spatial distortion that varium produced, but using a reaction powered by hydrogen. Plain, simple hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. Patty stared at the numbers on his screen. She checked them twice. She sat down on the floor and put her head in her hands and was very quiet for about 30 seconds. Then she stood up, patted Chris on the shoulder, and told him to run it again. He ran it again. It worked again. They built a prototype in 11 days and tested it inside a shielded chamber 300 feet underground. The chamber filled with light, and the sensors confirmed that they had generated a stable FTL field using nothing but hydrogen and a reactor small enough to fit inside a standard engine compartment. While Patty and her team were changing the future, Danny was fighting to survive the present. The unseen threat had finally tracked his movements, and they sent someone to end the problem permanently. It happened on a neutral station in the Kalahari system. Danny was walking through a narrow corridor after a meeting with a Dusani representative when a figure stepped out of the shadows. The figure was Mithari, tall and thin, with a blade in one of its 6 hands that glowed faintly with some kind of toxin. The blade moved fast. Danny was faster. He ducked the first strike and threw himself sideways, but the corridor was narrow, and the Mithari was between him and the exit. The second strike caught the wall where Danny's head had been a half-second before. Then Resic appeared. The little Fenari had been waiting at the end of the corridor, and he came running without hesitation. He threw himself at the Mithari's legs, all 4 feet of him, against a creature twice his height. The blade came down, and it did not miss this time. The toxin worked quickly. Resic collapsed, and the Mithari turned back toward Danny, but the delay had been enough. Danny's sidearm was in his hand, and he fired twice. The Mithari fell and did not get up. Danny dropped to his knees beside Resic. The Fenari's dark eyes were glazing, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. The toxin was spreading through his small body, and Danny could see the veins in his neck turning black. He picked Resic up. The Fenari weighed almost nothing. Danny ran through the station corridors, shouting for people to move, and carried his friend to the docking bay, where a human medical shuttle was waiting. The human medics did not know Fenari anatomy. They had never treated a Fenari patient before. But they knew toxicology, and they knew how to improvise, and they worked on Resic for 4 hours, with tools that any galactic hospital would have considered primitive. When it was over, Resic was alive. His pulse was weak but steady, and the toxin had been flushed from his system using a combination of human antivenoms and a field technique that the Fenari doctors would later describe as impossibly crude and impossibly effective. Danny sat beside Resic's bed and did not sleep for 2 days. When Resic finally opened his eyes, he looked up at Danny and said, "I think the council will be very upset that I am not dead." Almost. 3 days later, Patty Nguyen called President Calloway on a secure channel. "Mr. President," she said, "the new drive works. It doesn't need varium. It doesn't need anything they control. It runs on hydrogen." There was a long silence on the line. Patty could hear Nate Calloway breathing, slow and steady. "How much hydrogen do we have?" he asked. "Sir, it's the most common element in the universe. We have all of it." Another silence. Then Nate said, "Roll it out, Patty. Roll it out to everyone." Patty hung up the phone and looked at her team, who were gathered around her, exhausted and hopeful and scared. She took off her crooked glasses and cleaned them on her shirt. "You heard the man," she said. "We've got work to do." The hydrogen drive changed everything, and it changed everything fast. Within 3 weeks of President Calloway's order, human engineers were installing the new drives on Fenari merchant ships at a hidden dockyard near the edge of explored space. The Fenari captains watched with wide dark eyes as their old varium-dependent engines were pulled out and replaced with reactors that ran on the most common element in existence. Several of them cried, which for a Fenari involved a soft humming sound that filled the entire docking bay. Within 6 weeks, the Teleusians had received the drive specifications and were building their own. So had the Kelhari, the Dusani, the Vulpeth, and half a dozen other species that had spent centuries under the Council's boot. Patty Nguyen oversaw the distribution herself, traveling from system to system aboard a human frigate, making sure the technology was shared freely, completely, and without any conditions. No strings, Patty told every species that received the drive. It's yours. Do what you want with it. The Council's power had always rested on two pillars. The first was their combined military strength. The second, and far more important, was their control of varium, the mineral that every species in the galaxy needed to travel faster than light. Control the fuel, and you control the roads. Control the roads, and you control the galaxy. Now, suddenly, the roads were free. On the Silvered Ring, High Speaker Zael convened an emergency session of the Council. The amphitheater, which had always projected an image of unified authority, now felt like a room full of people who could not agree on what day it was. The Draven representative pounded his fist on his stone seat and demanded an immediate military strike against Earth and all of its allies. The Mythari representative counseled patience, arguing that the hydrogen drive would prove unreliable and that the younger species would eventually come back to the Council on their own. The Solene representative suggested opening negotiations, which prompted the Draven to pound his fist again, harder. Zael sat in his crystal chair and watched the argument with a stillness that his attendants found troubling. The light inside his body had been dim for weeks, and he had not spoken publicly since the news about the hydrogen drive. The fractures in his coalition were no longer cracks. They were canyons. While the Council argued with itself, Danny Holt was doing the most important work of his life. He had been officially reinstated as a full ambassador by President Calloway, and he traveled to the neutral world of Calyx Prime for a summit with representatives of 9 species that had either openly or secretly declared their interest in standing with humanity. The summit was held in a building made of red stone on a high plateau overlooking a vast orange desert. Danny arrived in his Navy uniform, clean-shaven again, looking like the officer he was. Resic came with him, walking with a slight limp from his wound, but refusing to use a cane. The 9 delegations filled a long table. They were a strange group. The Fenari were small and careful. The Kelhari were tall and thin, with feathered crests on their heads that changed color with their moods. The Dusani communicated partly through scent, which made the meeting room smell like a tropical garden after a rainstorm. And then there was Aetha. Aetha was a Tolusian diplomat, which meant she came from the species known for scholarship, quiet contemplation, and an almost religious devotion to politeness. Aetha had apparently missed those particular lessons. She was sharp-tongued, impatient, and had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she was reading the back of their skull. She waited until the other delegates had made their careful, diplomatic statements of support, and then she stood up and spoke directly to Danny. "Your technology is impressive," she said. "Your victory at Saturn was impressive. But impressive does not win a war against 300 warships. The Council will come for all of us eventually, and when they do, they will not make the same mistakes twice. So my question is simple, Ambassador Holt. Are you willing to fight beside us, or are you just handing out gifts and hoping we do the dying?" The room went very quiet. Several delegates looked uncomfortable. Danny looked at Aetha for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly the right question." He contacted Admiral Vicky Dawson that evening. The secure channel crackled with distance, but Vicky's voice came through as clear and calm as always. "The Tolusian delegate wants a joint fleet," Danny told her. "A real one. Multi-species combined command. Not a coalition of convenience. A fighting force." Vicky was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "I've been drawing up plans for that since the day we wanted Saturn," she said. "Tell them yes. Tell them I'll take command, and tell them every species fights as equals, or we don't fight at all. President Calloway approved the joint fleet after a single night of deliberation. His staff later said that he had spent most of that night alone on the White House roof, sitting in a folding chair, looking up at the sky with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. The fleet assembled in secret near a dead star system that had no name, only a catalog number. The humans brought their carrier vessels, their frigates, and their newly upgraded destroyers. The Fenari brought their fast, nimble merchant cruisers, hastily fitted with weapons. The Toulousians brought warships that were elegantly designed and surprisingly well-armed for a species of scholars. The Kelhari, the Dusani, the Volpeth, and 6 other species each contributed what they could. In total, the joint fleet numbered 162 ships. It was the first multi-species military force in galactic history that was not controlled by the Council. Vicky Dawson stood on the bridge of the Resolute Horizon and looked at the tactical display showing every ship in her fleet. Kevin Price stood beside her, his sharp eyes moving across the formation data, already calculating angles and probabilities. Vicky opened a broadcast to the entire fleet. Her voice reached every bridge, every engine room, every crew quarters aboard 162 ships crewed by 10 different species. "This is Admiral Dawson," she said. "Some of you have fought before. Some of you have not. Some of you are here because you believe in what we are doing. And some of you are here because you are angry. And some of you are here because you are scared. All of those reasons are good enough. We are not here to conquer anyone. We are not here to replace one ruling council with another. We are here to say, clearly and loudly, that no species gets to decide the worth of another. Hold your stations, trust your captains, and when the time comes, fight like it matters, because it does." Then, across 162 ships, crew members began tapping their consoles in a rhythmic pattern. It was a gesture the Fenari used to show respect, and somehow, without anyone planning it, every species in the fleet had adopted it. The Council's response came faster than anyone expected. The elder species, despite their disagreements, recognized that the joint fleet represented an existential threat to their authority. They assembled their combined military, over 300 warships from the Draven, the Valori, the Mathari, and the Solene. It was the largest fleet the galaxy had seen in living memory. The two forces met at the Dead Star System. The battle that followed would later be called the engagement at Hollow Sun, and it would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. The Council fleet attacked with overwhelming force, concentrating their fire on the center of the joint fleet's formation. Vicky lost 40 ships in the first hour. The Fenari cruiser that Resic was aboard took a direct hit to its port side and nearly broke apart. The Kelhari flagship lost its main engine and drifted, burning. But the joint fleet did not break. The human doctrine of aggressive adaptation, of shifting formations and exploiting momentary weaknesses, spread through the coalition like a language everyone suddenly understood. Toulousian ships covered wounded Fenari vessels. Dusani destroyers drew fire away from crippled human frigates. The fleet fought not as 10 separate navies, but as one living thing. Kevin Price worked his tactical station with a focus so intense that the crew around him barely dared to breathe. He tracked every ship on both sides, watching the patterns of the Council fleet's movements, looking for the one mistake that would open a door. He found it 3 hours into the battle. The Valori command ship, a massive vessel of white crystal at the heart of the Council formation, shifted its position to avoid debris from a destroyed Draven escort. The shift was small, barely noticeable, but it created a gap in the formation, a narrow corridor between two groups of Mithari warships that was unprotected for a distance of about 12 seconds at full speed. "Admiral," Kevin said, "I have a path to the command ship." Vicky looked at the data. The corridor was narrow, the window was tiny, and the resolute horizon would be taking fire from both sides for every second of the approach. "Take us through," she said. The resolute horizon surged forward, flanked by 6 human frigates. They hit the gap at maximum speed, and the Mithari ships on either side opened fire with everything they had. The carriers' shields flared and buckled. 2 of the escort frigates were destroyed. The bridge shook so hard that Molly Grant was thrown from her station. But they made it through. Danny Holt was waiting in the boarding bay with a team of 30 Marines. The moment the resolute horizon came alongside the Valori command ship, Danny's team launched across the gap in armored shuttles, cutting through the crystal hull with breaching charges and pouring into the corridors. The inside of the Valori ship was beautiful, all white light and smooth surfaces. Danny's Marines fought their way through corridors that hummed with energy, past Valori guards who moved with the speed and grace of dancers, but who had never faced enemies this determined and this close. Danny reached the bridge. The doors were sealed, but his engineer, a young woman named Katie Marsh, cut through them in 40 seconds with a plasma torch and a vocabulary that would have made a sailor blush. And there stood Jael. The High Speaker was alone. His guards had been defeated. His fleet was losing. But he stood at his full height, 9 feet of living crystal, and the light inside him burned so bright that Danny's visor automatically darkened. Danny could feel the energy radiating from Jael. It made his skin burn and his teeth ache. He raised his rifle on instinct, then slowly lowered it. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small data tablet. He held it up so Jael could see the screen. On the screen were images, hundreds of them, scrolling slowly. Each image showed a species. Some were familiar, most were not. Each image was labeled with a name, a date, and a classification. Subservient. Every single one. These are all the species the Council classified as subservient over the last 4,000 years, Danny said. His voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking. 89 of them are extinct now. Gone. Their worlds are empty. Their languages are dead. Nobody remembers their songs. Zael looked at the screen. The light inside his body flickered and dimmed, color by color, until he was almost dark. "We were not always like this," Zael said. His voice was barely a whisper. "The Valori were once explorers. We sought out new species because we wanted to learn from them. Somewhere over the centuries, we forgot why we were reaching out. We began to reach down instead." He looked at Danny with eyes that held 300 years of accumulated power, and beneath it, something that looked very much like shame. He spoke a single phrase in the old Valori tongue. The translator in Danny's earpiece processed it for a moment, then rendered it in English. "We forgot what we were." Danny lowered the tablet. Outside the bridge windows, the battle was slowing. Ships on both sides were holding fire, waiting, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath. "You can remember," Danny said quietly. "It's not too late to remember." The guns went silent slowly, the way a storm dies. First one ship stopped firing, then another, then a dozen more, until the only sounds left were the hiss of cooling metal and the quiet voices of crews checking on each other across the void. Admiral Vicky Dawson gave the order that would define her legacy. As the Council fleet began to pull back, their surviving ships turning toward open space, with engines running low and hulls scorched black, she opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke 6 words. "Let them go. Hold your fire." Kevin Price looked at her from his tactical station. 40% of the Council fleet was crippled or adrift. A single sustained push would destroy them entirely. The numbers were right there on his screen, clear as daylight. "Admiral," he said carefully, We can end this. We can, Vicky agreed, but that's not what we're here for. Any ship that powers down its weapons gets safe passage out. No exceptions. The order went out across the joint fleet. Talusian captains relayed it. Fenari cruisers pulled back. Kelhari destroyers lowered their weapons. One by one, the council ships powered down and drifted toward the relay gates. And not a single shot was fired at their backs. Aboard the Valori command ship, Danny Holt stood on the bridge with Zale and watched through the crystal walls as the two fleets slowly separated. The high speaker had not moved since their conversation. He stood like a statue of dim glass, and the silence around him felt heavy with the weight of centuries. What happens now? Zale asked. Now we talk, Danny said. Actually talk. Not one side talking and the other side listening. Both sides at the same table with the same voice. The council will not accept that easily. The council just lost a battle they expected to win in an hour. I think they might be more flexible than you expect. Zale turned his great head and looked down at Danny. For a moment, just a moment, the light inside him flickered back to a warmer color, something close to gold. You are a strange species, Zale said. We get that a lot, Danny replied. The negotiations began 2 weeks later, aboard the Silvered Ring. The station had been occupied by a joint peacekeeping force made up of ships from 8 different species, and for the first time in its long history, the great amphitheater was filled with representatives who were not all chosen by the elder races. Lena Morgan led the human delegation. She arrived wearing a simple dark suit, carrying a single folder of documents, and looking like a woman who had not slept properly in a year, but was too stubborn to let it show. She had spent the 2 weeks since the battle preparing for this moment, working through every clause and provision and sub-article until she could recite the proposed charter in her sleep. She probably did recite it in her sleep. On the rare occasions she actually slept. Beside her sat Danny, freshly shaved and back in his dress uniform, and Patty Nguyen, who had been asked to attend as a technical advisor, and who looked deeply uncomfortable in the formal setting. She kept adjusting her glasses and fidgeting with her pen, until Danny gently put his hand on her arm and told her to breathe. Across the table sat representatives of every species in the galaxy that cared to attend, and most of them did. The Fenari sent a full diplomatic team, led by Resic, who walked into the amphitheater with his slight limp and his steady dark eyes, and received a standing acknowledgement from the human delegation. The Talusians sent Atha, who looked around the amphitheater with the expression of someone who was already mentally editing the architecture. The Kelhari, the Dusani, the Volpeth, and the others each took their places. And the elder species came too. The Mithari were there, quiet and watchful. The Selene floated in their tanks, their colors thoughtful. The Vailori sent Jael himself, who entered the amphitheater with slow, measured steps, and took a seat at the table, rather than in the high crystal chair he had occupied for 3 centuries. The chair sat empty above him, and he did not look at it. The Draven almost did not come. Fleet Commander Gorath, who had survived the engagement at Hollow Sun aboard one of the retreating ships, argued fiercely against any negotiation. The Draven were warriors, he said. They did not sit at tables with species they could crush. But the Draven had not crushed anyone. And, when their government calculated the cost of continuing the war against a coalition that now controlled its own FTL technology and outnumbered the Draven 3-1, the mathematics won out over the pride. They sent a delegation. It was small and unhappy, but it was there. The negotiations took 3 months. They were difficult in ways that battles were not. In a battle, the enemy was clear. In a negotiation, the enemy was often the gap between what people wanted and what they were willing to accept. The hardest moment came in the 7th week, when the Draven delegation walked out. The issue was conscription. For centuries, The Draven had used their military strength to demand labor from weaker species, building their infrastructure and mining their worlds with workers who had no choice. The proposed charter abolished conscription entirely, and the Draven representative, a scarred officer named Varric, said flatly that this was unacceptable and left the room. The other delegations watched the door close behind him. Atha said something sharp in Tellusian that the translator rendered as a word meaning predictable. Zale said nothing. Lena looked at the closed door for a long time. Then she stood up. "I need a ship," she said. Danny looked at her. "Where are you going?" "To talk to them." "Lena, the Draven homeworld is a fortress. You can't just fly in and watch me." She flew to the Draven homeworld alone, in a small diplomatic shuttle with no weapons and no escort. When she entered Draven space, 4 warships surrounded her and demanded she identify herself. She gave her name and her title, and said she was here to speak with the War Council. The Draven let her land, probably out of sheer curiosity more than anything else. No one had ever flown to their homeworld, alone and unarmed before. It was either the bravest thing they had ever seen, or the most foolish, and the Draven respected both. Lena spent 4 days on the surface, in a stone building that served as the War Council's headquarters. She ate their food, which was spicy and tough, and required more chewing than she had expected. She listened to their arguments, which were loud and passionate, and occasionally involved furniture being broken. And she talked. She did not offer the Draven special treatment. She did not promise them exceptions or side deals or secret advantages. She told them, plainly and simply, that the new charter would treat every species the same, including the Draven, that their military tradition would be respected and their warriors honored, that no one was asking them to be less than what they were. The charter only asked that they stop forcing others to be less than what they were. Varric, the scarred officer, stared at her across a stone table and said, "You have no army behind you. You have no threats to make. Why should we listen?" Lena met his eyes and did not blink. "Because I came alone," she said, "and that should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously I take this." The Draven War Council argued for another full day after Lena finished speaking. Then Varric walked into the room where Lena was waiting, sat down across from her, and said 2 words, "We agree." Lena flew back to the Silvered Ring with the Draven delegation aboard her shuttle. When she walked into the amphitheater, she looked exhausted and slightly singed from 4 days of Draven cooking, but the folder in her hand held signatures that completed the charter. The final document abolished the subservient classification. It established a new galactic assembly with rotating leadership and proportional representation for every species, regardless of age or military power. It created trade protections for developing civilizations and a mutual defense compact that guaranteed no species would face aggression alone. No species held veto power. Disputes would be resolved through arbitration, not decree. And woven through every article was a single principle that Lena had insisted on from the first day. Every species decides its own worth, no one else. President Nate Calloway flew to the Silvered Ring for the signing ceremony. He stood in the great amphitheater, in the same spot where Lena had been silenced less than a year before, and he signed the charter with a pen that had belonged to his grandfather, a wheat farmer from Kansas who had never traveled farther than Topeka. He kept his remarks brief. "Earth didn't fight for dominance," he said. "We fought for a seat at the table. The table is big enough for everyone now. Let's not waste it." The amphitheater filled with sound. Some of it was applause. Some of it was the Fenari humming. Some of it was the Kalahari clicking their beaks in approval. The Draven, characteristically, said nothing, but Varric gave Nate a single nod that, from a Draven, was practically an embrace. Danny and Resic watched the ceremony from the gallery above. Resic stood with his weight slightly off his injured leg, his dark eyes bright. "My people have a saying," Resic told Danny. "The universe tests those it intends to trust." Danny leaned on the railing and looked down at the amphitheater full of species that a year ago would never have been in the same room. "Humans have something similar," he said, "though we usually phrase it with more profanity." Resic made the small huffing sound that was the Fenari version of a laugh. Danny grinned. In the months that followed, the galaxy began to rebuild itself along new lines. Vicky Dawson retired from active command and accepted a teaching position at the Joint Naval Academy established on Calyx Prime. Her first class included officers from 12 different species, and on the first day she told them the same thing she had told every crew she had ever commanded. Trust your people, watch your angles, and never assume you know everything. Kevin Price succeeded her as Fleet Admiral of the Joint Defense Force, the youngest human to ever hold such a rank. Molly Grant became the first human to serve as a permanent communications liaison on the Silvered Ring, where her ability to make complicated systems work smoothly proved just as valuable in diplomacy as it had been in battle. Patty Nguyen's hydrogen drive became the standard across most of known space within 2 years. She was offered more awards and honors than she could count. She turned them all down. "The drive belongs to everyone," she told a reporter who asked why. "I'd rather be in the lab." Lena Morgan was appointed as Earth's first permanent ambassador to the new Galactic Assembly. On her first day in the role, she walked through the amphitheater on her way to her office and passed the spot where Zael had silenced her with a wave of his hand a lifetime ago. She paused, and she allowed herself a single, quiet smile before she kept walking. 50 years later, on a warm afternoon in the amphitheater that had once been the seat of an empire and was now the floor of a parliament, a young Veilori student raised her hand during a history lesson. Her crystalline body had the faintly green tint of youth, and her voice rang with the clear, bell-like quality of her kind. "Teacher," she said, "why did the council think they could control a species they hadn't even studied properly?" Her teacher was an elderly Fenari with gray patches across his neck and wise, dark eyes. He looked out through the great windows of the amphitheater, past the metal curve of the station, and into the endless spread of stars beyond. "They made the oldest mistake in the universe," he said. "They measured strength by what they could see, and humans kept most of theirs hidden until it mattered." The student considered this for a moment. "That seems like a very dangerous thing to forget," she said. The old Fenari looked at her and tilted his head in that way his species had, a gesture that meant he was thinking about something important. "Yes," he said, "it was." Outside the station, the stars went on forever, burning with the quiet, patient light of a galaxy that had finally learned, the hard way, that the smallest voice in the room is not always the weakest. The Silvered Ring was the oldest station in the known galaxy. It hung in the empty dark between two dead stars, a massive circle of pale metal that had been built so long ago that no one remembered who had placed it there. For thousands of years, the 12 elder species had gathered inside its great amphitheater to make decisions that shaped the lives of billions. They decided trade routes and borders. They settled wars and divided resources. And on this particular day, they were deciding the fate of humanity. Ambassador Lena Morgan stood at the center of the amphitheater floor and tried very hard not to let her anger show on her face. She was a tall woman in her late 40s with short brown hair and steady hands. She had spent 20 years in diplomacy, first on Earth and then among the stars. She knew how to keep her voice even when everything inside her wanted to scream. Beside her stood Captain Danny Holt. He was younger than Lena by almost a decade, with a square jaw and calm blue eyes that gave away nothing. He wore his navy dress uniform with every button in place. His hands were clasped behind his back, and to anyone watching, He looked perfectly relaxed, but Lena could see the small muscle twitching in his jaw. Danny was not relaxed at all. Above them, arranged in a rising half-circle of stone seats, the representatives of the 12 elder species looked down. The Draven were massive and reptilian, their green scales catching the light. The Mithari were thin and silver-skinned, with 6 arms folded neatly across their chests. The Soline floated in sealed water tanks, their jellyfish-like bodies pulsing with soft color. And at the very top, in a chair carved from a single piece of white crystal, sat Zale, the Valori High Speaker. His body was made of something that looked like living glass, and light moved inside him in slow, beautiful patterns. He had ruled the council for over 300 years. His voice, when he spoke, sounded like a choir of bells. The council has reviewed the submitted records of the species known as humans, Zale said. Their technological development is noted. Their cultural output is noted. Their military capacity is noted. He paused, and the light inside his chest shifted from blue to a cold, pale white. It is the unanimous judgment of this council that humanity does not meet the threshold for sovereign classification. Lena felt the words hit her like a physical blow, but she kept her face still. Humanity is hereby designated as a subservient species under Section 12 of the Galactic Charter, Zale continued. This designation removes sovereign territorial rights, independent trade authority, and the right to refuse labor conscription by any elder species. The designation is effective immediately. The amphitheater was silent for a moment. Then Lena stepped forward. "High Speaker," she said, and her voice carried clearly through the vast room. Humanity developed faster than light travel independently. We were not given this technology. We built it ourselves, in a single generation, after discovering the principles through our own research. By every written standard in your own charter, that alone qualifies us for sovereign status. Zale looked down at her. The light inside him did not change. "The council's decision is final," he said. "You didn't even read the full archive," Lena pressed. "You reviewed a summary prepared by species who have never visited our world, never spoken to our people, never." Ambassador Morgan. Zale raised one translucent hand, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Lena's voice stopped, not because she chose to stop, but because some force pressed gently against her throat. "The council's decision is final." He lowered his hand. The pressure vanished. Lena breathed in slowly through her nose and said nothing more. The session ended. The representatives filed out through their separate exits, most of them not even glancing at the 2 humans standing alone on the amphitheater floor. Lena gathered her documents into her case with careful, precise movements. Danny stood beside her and waited until the last alien had left the room. "That went about as well as expected," Danny said quietly. "Worse," Lena replied. "Subservient classification. They're going to send labor ships within a month." Then he leaned a little closer and lowered his voice even further. Maybe the council should have looked a little closer at the species they just decided to leash. Lena glanced at him. There was something in his eyes that was not anger and not fear. It was the steady, patient look of a man who had already begun to plan. 12 hours later, and several thousand light-years away, President Nate Calloway sat behind his desk in the Oval Office and listened to the secure transmission from the Silvered Ring. He was 56 years old, a former structural engineer from Kansas who had entered politics late in life and somehow ended up leading the country at the worst possible time. He had big hands, an aligned face, and a habit of going very still when he was thinking. His advisors filled the chairs around the room. Secretary of State Carl Avery argued for an immediate diplomatic protest through back channels. Defense Secretary Maria Fuentes wanted visible military readiness. National Security Advisor Greg Palmer suggested a combination of both. They talked over each other, their voices rising. Nate let them talk for 10 minutes. Then he held up one hand, and the room went quiet. "They just told 8 billion people that they're property," Nate said. His voice was soft. "Every person on this planet, every child in every school, property." No one spoke. Nate picked up the secure phone on his desk and dialed a number that connected to Fleet Command, a facility buried deep inside a Colorado mountain. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. "Admiral Dawson," the voice said. "Vicky, it's Nate." "I heard, sir." "Get everything we have online," Nate said, quietly. There was a pause on the other end that lasted exactly 1 second. "Understood, Mr. President." Nate hung up the phone. "We're going to smile," he told them. "We're going to send polite messages through every proper channel. And while we're smiling, we're going to get ready for what comes next." On the Valori homeworld, in a small office filled with holographic screens, a junior analyst named TiesHFY was doing what the council had not bothered to do. He was reading the full historical archive of humanity. TiesHFY was young for a Valori, barely 80 years old, and his crystalline body still had the faintly green tint of youth. He was thorough by nature, and something about the human archive had caught his attention. He scrolled through centuries of records. He read about their early wars, their plagues, their revolutions. He read about how they had split the atom and then used it to destroy 2 of their own cities, and then felt such horror at what they had done that they spent the next century trying to make sure it never happened again, while also building enough weapons to do it 10,000 times over. He stopped scrolling when he reached an entry about something called the Second World War. He read about a conflict that had killed 70 million people in 6 years. He read about ordinary farmers and shopkeepers who had picked up weapons and crossed oceans to fight. He read about cities burned to ash and then rebuilt within a generation. He read about a species that, when pushed to the edge of destruction, did not surrender. They pushed back harder. TiesHFY sat very still for a long time. Then he composed an urgent memo to High Speaker Zale, flagging the archive and recommending an immediate review of the subservient classification. He sent the memo through proper channels. It arrived in Zale's office and was placed in a queue behind 400 other messages. It would not be read for another 19 days. By then, it would be far too late.